Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
Throughout history, the perception of Black Africans as a threat has been a persistent narrative rooted in deeply ingrained prejudices, economic motivations, and geopolitical power struggles. This perception did not emerge from a vacuum, but was carefully constructed and perpetuated by those who sought to justify exploitation, colonization, and systemic subjugation. The story of why Black Africans were historically viewed as a threat is as complex as it is harrowing, interwoven with themes of fear, cultural misunderstanding, and deliberate manipulation of narratives. To understand why Black Africans were historically framed as a threat, one must first delve into the early encounters between African civilizations and the outside world. Long before the arrival of European colonizers, Africa was home to some of the most advanced and sophisticated societies on Earth. From the pyramids of Egypt to the trading empires of Mali, from the scholarly hubs of Timbuktu to the engineering marvels of Great Zimbabwe, African civilizations demonstrated a remarkable capacity for innovation, governance, and cultural expression. These accomplishments, however, often defied the expectations and biases of foreign observers, particularly those from Europe and the Middle East, who were unprepared to encounter societies that rivaled or even surpassed their own. The initial exchanges between African societies and outsiders were often marked by mutual curiosity and trade. African gold, ivory, spices, and textiles were highly prized commodities, and African merchants engaged in extensive trade networks that stretch across continents. However, as European powers began to expand their maritime capabilities in the 15th and 16th centuries, these relationships shifted. What had once been a partnership of equals began to tilt toward exploitation, as European nations sought to control Africa's resources and labor for their own benefit. It was during this period that the seeds of the threat narrative were sown. European explorers and traders, driven by a combination of greed and a desire to dominate global trade, began to depict Africa and its people in ways that justified their imperial ambitions. The continent was portrayed as a land of savagery and chaos, its inhabitants as barbaric and inferior. These depictions were not merely the result of ignorance or misunderstanding. They were deliberate constructions designed to rationalize the enslavement and exploitation of millions of Africans. The notion of Africans as a threat was further fueled by fear of the unknown, fear of difference, and fear of resistance. For many Europeans, Africa represented an unfamiliar and mysterious world, its vast landscapes and diverse cultures unlike anything they had encountered before. This unfamiliarity bred fear, which was then projected onto the people of Africa. Their physical differences, including dark skin and unique cultural practices, were seized upon as evidence of otherness, and this otherness was often equated with danger. This fear was not confined to the realm of imagination. As European powers began to colonize Africa, they encountered fierce resistance from African communities. Leaders like Shaka Zulu, Queen Zinga, and Samori Toure, among many others, demonstrated extraordinary resilience and military prowess in the face of foreign aggression. These acts of defiance challenged the narrative of African inferiority and reinforced the perception of Africans as a threat to European dominance. The transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history, further cemented the view of Black Africans as a threat. The very act of enslaving millions of people required a moral justification, and so a narrative was constructed that dehumanized Africans, portraying them as less than human and inherently dangerous. Enslaved Africans were often depicted as rebellious and violent, a portrayal that ignored the brutal conditions they endured and the humanity of their resistance. This depiction served a dual purpose. On one hand, it justified the brutal measures used to subjugate enslaved Africans, from whippings to executions. On the other hand, it reinforced the idea that Africans were a threat to the social order, an idea that persisted long after slavery was abolished. In the United States, for example, the myth of the dangerous black man became a cornerstone of systemic racism, used to justify segregation, lynching, and mass incarceration. During the era of colonialism, the narrative of Africans as a threat took on new dimensions. European colonizers justified their conquest of Africa with the claim that they were bringing civilization to a savage continent. This so-called civilizing mission was based on the belief that Africans were incapable of governing themselves and posed a threat to global progress. However, the reality of colonialism often belied these claims. Far from uplifting African societies, colonial powers exploited their resources and labor, suppressing local cultures and traditions in the process. Resistance to colonial rule was widespread, and once again, African leaders and communities were framed as threats to the colonial order. This framing was used to justify brutal crackdowns on dissent, from massacres to forced relocations, further entrenching the narrative of Africans as dangerous and unruly. The 19th century saw the rise of scientific racism, a pseudoscientific movement that sought to classify humans into racial hierarchies. Black Africans were placed at the bottom of these hierarchies, depicted as biologically and intellectually inferior to other races. These ideas were propagated by prominent scientists and academics, lending an air of legitimacy to the belief that Africans were a threat to progress and civilization. This pseudoscience had profound and far-reaching consequences. It shaped public policy, influenced education, and provided a veneer of respectability to racist ideologies. The belief in African inferiority and dangerousness was used to justify a wide range of atrocities, from the genocidal practices of King Leopold II in the Congo to the systemic disenfranchisement of African Americans in the United States. In addition to being portrayed as a physical and political threat, Black Africans were also framed as a cultural threat. African traditions, religions, and ways of life were often demonized by colonial powers, who sought to replace them with European norms and values. This cultural imperialism was particularly evident in the realm of religion, where Christian missionaries sought to eradicate indigenous African beliefs and practices. African cultures were not merely passive victims of this onslaught. They resisted and adapted in remarkable ways. However, the portrayal of African culture as a threat to civilized society persisted, shaping attitudes toward Africa and its diaspora well into the modern era. The historical view of Black Africans as a threat has left a lasting legacy, one that continues to influence global attitudes and policies. From the racial profiling of Black individuals in Western societies to the portrayal of Africa as a continent of chaos and violence in the media, the echoes of this narrative are still with us today. Yet, the resilience and achievements of Black Africans throughout history also offer a powerful counter-narrative. From the liberation movements that dismantled colonialism to the cultural renaissance that has redefined African identity in the 21st century, the story of Africa is one of triumph over adversity. By understanding the roots of the threat narrative, we can begin to dismantle it, replacing fear and prejudice with empathy and respect.